谢谢大家。
Thank you, everyone. Welcome to this session. This session has as topic the art of influence, or the influence of Asian arts. As we know, in human history, the Asian people have created brilliant physical and also intangible or tangible wealth. That's why the Asian arts has a lot of heritages. During the recent years, the Asian art, movie, music have greatly exported and become a very huge bond, very solid bond, culture bond with other cultures. During the latest years, for example, K-pop in Korea, and also the manga in Japan, or Bollywood movies, as well as Chinese TV series or digital contents have been very welcomed by different culture, different countries. That's why we're talking about this topic, how Asian arts is influencing the world and bring about more recognition and more knowledge about Asia. Before starting, I would like to each of you to use 1 minute, spend 1 minute to introduce yourself, your career. How is your career linked with Asian culture and Asian soft power? Begin with Karen.
Thank you for showing up. Time is the most precious. So I produce and host a weekly television interview show with global thought leaders. I know the US-China trade war has been grabbing a lot of attention and headlines, but what I see is underneath is the fight for the technology dominance. So what I do is I try to tell the West the stories and the faces behind China's innovation, how the traditional industries are transforming themselves, how the new technology companies came to place, and what are they thinking in terms of future. And I really want to build a bridge between China and the West. So when we think about China, GDP-wise, hardware-wise, can leapfrog in a lot of things and develop very fast. But when we think about software and where people are in terms of their thinking, there are just certain stages that you need to go through. So, I try to tell, from the West, then, what people are thinking in terms of, the purpose and the values of economic development, technological innovation, and, what are they thinking in terms of giving back to society, making the world into a better place than when they came. So trying to provide inspirations for people in China as well. So I'm passionate about telling insights into the future to help people understand change, manage change, and prepare for change better. And also to spread positive values.
Yeah, thank you. Nadya, please.
Hi, my name is Nadya Hutagalung. I am half Indonesian, half Australian, and have been living in Singapore since 1995. I have one foot very firmly rooted in the media industry. I've been in the media industry for 30 years. And another foot very firmly, and mostly that's where my heart is, in conservation and sustainability. And I first started speaking about orangutans, the big orange or dark red hairy ape that comes from both Indonesia and Malaysia in the 90s. And I started a campaign to reduce the demand for ivory, elephant ivory, for the Asian consumers, 2011, 2012, and now focus on Sumatran elephants. So I use the platform that I've been blessed with to help talk about issues that I think the world needs to know about, and help to encourage and inspire companies and individuals to find their purpose and have more impact in the world.
Thank you, Nadya. My name is Kuek. I work for Netflix. Netflix is a global streaming company. We are available in more than 190 markets. I think where we can play a relevant role in today's discussion is that when we have great content and we are always looking for amazing storytelling from all parts of the world, this content can travel around the world. So I think in many ways we're as much as a distribution channel for great Asian stories, and I think this session that we are having is super relevant.
各位领导，大家好。
Hello, everyone.
The Appell. I'm from the U.S. China Comedy Center, 中美喜剧中心. We have a courtyard theater in Beijing. We do live comedy and also write comedy for television shows in China and in the U.S., wherever we can get onto the screen. Our goal is to use comedy to bridge cultural gaps. So we have a lot of people nowadays, you know, compared to previous generations where you might have never had an American go to Asia, or you might have never had people from Asia go to other countries. Now we have plenty of people going back and forth, and we have a lot of people who can do business and very few that can make people laugh. And so it's our goal to find a way to use laughter and humor to tell those stories and be a small part in bringing the stories of our people from around the world together.
OK，好，谢谢。所以
Thank you. So, first part, introduction. The following part will be related to your own career, to begin with Carol. Carol, I know you're working for Phoenix TV. You're observing our society, our youth, the most among a lot of people. So from your point of view, the youngest people in Asia facing to all these changes when they are growing up, what is, in terms of soft power, the brain changes that they can bring about, and how could they impact the world in the future and be integrated into the world?
About strong culture influences or strong culture symbols. What do we think of when we think about the world, right? Maybe Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Marvel, like superheroes. So all these things take time to build. And when you think about their counterparts in China, for example, Disney's counterpart, all the big entertainment parks, their focuses is pretty much still on building hardware, because that's what attracts a lot of audiences. They're entertaining, for example, Disney's counterpart in China, one of the largest entertainment parks. They attract millions of visitors every year. Their revenues are going up really fast. So they don't really have the time. They can really spare the time to really think about, doing something new, or there's a temptation to always continue doing, what they're doing to extend their successes instead of doing something new. So I think when the market becomes more mature and more sophisticated, then there's more of a need to innovate and think about, building stronger culture influences, symbols, and brands. And when I think about the younger generation, the older generation who built China into what it is today, they grew up in an environment that's very poor, that was largely close to the world. There's no brand differentiation or any product differentiation. So they're not really used to building something that's international or like thinking about international influences. But when we think about the newer generation, they grew up in an environment that's relatively more well-off, right? The post-80s, post-90s. And that's an environment that's more open to the West. So when we think about, so they're more used to international influences when they were growing up. So we're already seeing some successful brands, like locally, they're going international. So I think that, and they're more open-minded in building something more creative rather than the older generation. And also when we think about, I guess, cultural influences, education system needs to change as well. So in the old days, China came to be where it is today because of manufacturing, largely. But manufacturing, when you think about manufacturing, only very specific professional skills are needed. So you delve into, math, engineering, and other things, subjects, right? But now when we are entering the new economy, creative economy, then what do you need? You need humanities, you need liberal studies, you need critical thinking, you need creative thinking and all that. So when we think about the newer generation, they have more of a hope in building something international because the way that they're educated and the kind of influences they get is very different from the old generation.
OK，所以 Carol，这个基本
So Carol is mainly based on human being. So you think that the human being is very crucial for cultural influence. You have seen the changes in terms of the new generation. So
To the next stage of development.
OK，Thank you。Nadya，
Nadia, about you, something about you. I know that you have, as a celebrity, you have created a very interesting choice. You have done a right choice to work as a ambassador in UN. What was the main main motivation for you to make this change? Could you please share with us about this?
Sure. Okay. My role with the UN is rather new. It's only, I think, maybe since 2012. And the reason that I have that role with the UN is because of the work that I've been doing for quite some time before that. I was a young mum, and I first got, it actually all started because I'm a mum, and I first got my diving license before my eldest was born. In Thailand, and when I went diving, I could see under the sea, and everything was so many different colors and shapes and sizes, and it was like an alien landscape under there, and so many different types of fish. And I actually, to be honest with you, I was petrified. I was so scared. I was crying in my mask and holding onto my dive buddy, and I'm like, what is this? But then on the second dive, I really forced myself to get close to everything. If I have this thing, if I'm afraid of something, I make sure that I get really close to it to understand it, and then it dispels the fear. And I fell in love with the ocean. And then I had my eldest child. So he's now 25. But what happened was that after he was born, I went diving again in the same location, about a year and a half to 2 years apart from the first time that I went diving there. And in that space, in that period of time, the ocean had changed so drastically. The coral was no longer colorful, it was broken and gray, it was rubble. The fish were far less fish, and the fish that were there were in fish traps. And there was already some plastic floating on the sea. And so for me, being a mom and realizing that, holy cow, in my lifetime, our planet has changed so much. Imagine in the life of my child. And this was to me the real sort of Kickstarter. I mean, of course, I have my mum to thank also, because I grew up with her talking about living off the grid and being self-sustainable and all of these things that I didn't understand when I was a child. But she planted those seeds in my mental continuum. But once I became a mum myself and saw how drastically the planet had changed, I realized that I had to do everything in my capacity, my limited capacity. I'm not a scientist. I left school when I was 12, and I left home when I was 12. So I just did whatever I could to be able to make an impact. And once I once I was blessed with the platform that was a regional platform, most of the television shows that I do are Southeast Asia wide, not specifically one country. I realized that I had incredible impact, and I needed to use that voice and that platform responsibly, and started to get the feedback from that. And the viewers and my audience started to resonate with that and started to make decisions in their own lives and be inspired to make choices that were a little bit wiser for themselves. So that was the art of influencing people positively. And I think that's the huge responsibility of the media, to be able to tell those stories creatively, to be able to influence change in the minds of people who wouldn't normally think about such things. So that's how I started my journey.
OK, got it. Great. Well,
I want to ask another question. In the past, we thought that entertainment comments can be easily spread especially in the digital area. So from your perspective, because you are involved in this field, so from your own perspective, are there anything about welfare, about the public well-being? Is this being more spread, like use the new media, and we have new users, new audience? Are they more easily accept this kind of change?
Absolutely, social media plays a huge role in being able to influence. When we did, in 2011, I started the Let Elephants Be Elephants campaign to reduce the demand for ivory in Asia. Part of that campaign, one part of it was the documentary that I produced that went to air on Nat Geo, Nat Geo Wild, and Star World across Asia. And then the other part of that was the social media aspect, where we used social media as a platform, but what we did is we used art as a medium. So what we did is we ran art competitions, and so the contestants would do digital art or traditional art and then submit their submissions on social media using hashtags that then obviously influenced their audience as well to reach a wider audience. Then we narrowed it down to 12 winners, and those 12 winners went into a journal that was then sold and raised money also for the elephants. So there's many ways to influence, and I think we need to be creative about how we tell stories and really look at all of the options of telling stories and creating impact. And I think this is true also not only of people in the media industry about the choices that are made. And when I made, what happened with Let Elephants Be Elephants was a series of choices and stories being told. So there was a woman that I met in 2011, and she's a zoologist and a human-elephant conflict specialist and has written 3 books on Africa. And she was telling the story about what was happening with elephants, and I couldn't believe it, you know, because I grew up in Australia and then I was in Singapore since 1995. I didn't see ivory anywhere, and I thought there was really not an issue anymore. And for somebody who is in this space, I was quite shocked to see that really we are at a critical time for elephants, and being driven by the Asian demand. So she said, hey, you know, she could see that I was interested. She said, do you want to go to Africa? And I said, yeah, I want to go. I want to go and learn for myself and see what's happening. So then I said, you know what, I'm going to go. And then I spoke to a producer and a head of camera that I was working with for Asia's Next Top Model, which I was the host of. And we just finished season 1, and I said, hey, you know what? I want to go and learn what's happening in Africa about the ivory trade. Do you want to come? And they said, yeah, let's go. So we set off to make some videos for YouTube. And once we got there, we understood the severity of the situation and realized we can't do a series of videos for YouTube. We have to do a documentary. And so it was just a series of like, yeah, if you give someone the option to do something that's positive and have impact, and you give them the easy steps to do that, people want to make a difference.
Thank you， 谢谢 Nadya 分享她的。
Thank you for your story. I think this story, it is very attractive. The first is due to its the choice, and her experience is very valuable. Today we are talking about the cultural influence of Asia, and such influence is actually done by human beings, and this is the choice of every man.
That quickly, just to show the importance of, or the impact of the work that we did. So this was a documentary coming out of Asia, targeting the Asian consumers, but that had global impact. So the numbers of elephants, when we initially started our campaign, that were being killed were quite high. That was actually the peak of the modern ivory trade crisis. And that was because 80% of consumers in Asia did not know that elephants have to die for them to have ivory. They thought that the tusks fall out, or you know, you can cut them off and they grow back, which is simply not true. You have to hack the whole face off the elephant. And that was an easy conversion because generally everybody loves elephants more than they love ivory. And what happened was, in my beginning of the journey, and then last year, when I went back to Kenya, the numbers of elephants being killed in Kenya specifically had dropped so dramatically. All of the places, in fact, there was only 1 elephant killed in the area that I was working in, that we filmed in, and that was due to human-elephant conflict. And in Thailand, all of the places that we featured in the documentary no longer had ivory when I went back a year later after the documentary was aired. And Thailand was then the main sponsor of the World Wildlife Day at the United Nations, which I addressed the General Assembly. So that's just showing that impact of something coming out of Asia and having global influence and impact.
Thank you. It's a great story. And
Okay, just now, Nadia mentioned another important point. When she did all of these meaningful activities, actually today, it is easier for us to get a global impact. So the impact is not only within one area, but also it can spread into the whole world. So next question is to Kuek. He is a representative of the internet platform. So from your experience, is there any digital that we can know the global influence? Can we know the trend? Are there any meaningful findings?
And Nadia talked about.
Yeah.
I think the internet as a technology has enabled us to do things that were not imaginable a while back. Carol was talking about cultural symbols, and that how many people in the world might be familiar with Mickey Mouse and the Marvel franchise, but the Asian symbols might have traveled a little less than their Western counterparts. Interestingly, I grew up in Singapore. I'm from Singapore. And I don't know how many people in the audience remember this, but I grew up with Sun Wukong or the Monkey King as a franchise. So as a family, we would watch that. But a confluence of factors would need to come in for me to be exposed to that. The local broadcaster would need to pick that as a piece of IP. There is fixed programming that is available on any given day, and you need to put it in a slot that a young child like me would be able to be there to take that in. I think the beauty of the internet right now is that we have unlimited shelf space. And what that has allowed is for a company like us that fortunately has a global reach to pick out all these stories and have them travel. So from India, there's this title called Chota Bheem. It has no dialogue. It's a piece of IP meant for children. We're very proud to be carrying that. You talked about numbers, and I'm happy to share that as well. When we take a blockbuster IP from China, like Wandering Earth, 流浪地球, immediately when it comes to our platform, we translate it to more than 20 different languages in subs and dubs. And also when you look at the artwork in terms of whether it's being used for marketing or for the user interface, it gets that same treatment as well. And so immediately, an IP coming out from China gets distributed around the world. And it's only possible because we have one global product. The sobering message that you told us, Nadia, that diving and seeing the fish, I think as a global citizen and as an employee of the company, I get very excited when I see titles like Our Planet appear. And then you have this general message that gets resonated over a platform like ours. In terms of the kind of reach that we're seeing for things that are coming out of the region, I would say that we see a trend where it's increasing. So we have a title which is our first original coming out from India called Sacred Games. It is set in Mumbai. Mumbai is very much a character in the show itself. And you would think that a title like this would find a great Indian audience. The good news is that it did. But also more interesting is that 2 out of 3 viewers for that content actually is living outside of India. And when we take a piece of content from Indonesia, for example, the night comes for us. When we get that piece of IP, we don't think of doing the premiere in Jakarta necessarily. We premiere in LA so that immediately when a piece of IP comes on, we think about how it can travel globally. So I think in this small way, we can be seen as a distribution channel or a vehicle almost. Nadya was talking about the power of social media. I think when you have a global vehicle like this, we should see it as an opportunity.
Interesting. 刚才
Just now, you mentioned the Indian films, so that's TV series. So over 2/3 of the audience are from places other than the India. So you have more than half of the users are from areas out of USA. So I want to add another question. By your from your perspective, so what are their demands or requirements from these from our staff? What should we do to better help our audience and help the content to reach the world?
Stories that come from the region.
Okay.
I think a thing that we should embrace about the technology is that it allows us to cater to individuals' tastes. And so I think a phenomenon that we have seen is that if you enjoy the horror genre, for example, what might happen is that we will the service is able to serve you up contents that comes from all over the world that fits with that genre. So in that sense, I think you're really seeing this seamlessness or these borderless content travel. So I think that is something really to be looked at. Naturally, I think the viability of the business or Asian content telling would be in terms of making sure that this very nascent industry stays vibrant. I'm quoting third-party numbers here, but an estimate is that by the year 2022, the video on-demand industry would bring in $10.1 billion to the Asia region. And we're already seeing it. So, I mean, like you look at Pinewood Studios in Malaysia, for example, we have 2 productions there. One is a piece of IP that's already on the service, which is Marco Polo. Another one is coming up, it's called Ghost Bride. There's going to be continued investments into the region. So we see places even like Singapore becoming a VFX and an animation hub. So I think really, if you ask me what industry needs to do now to make sure that there's a continued viability of Asian storytelling, I would say that allowing this nascent industry to grow organically without fettering it would be very important.
Thank you. Okay.
It's very interesting that, you know, before the power of influence, and when we think about, you know, dominant, like soft power, that sort of like goes hand in hand with the country's economic power, right? Like US, if it's a strong country, then its culture travels and dominates. But now in the new era, because of the power of the internet and, you know, platforms like Netflix, then it's more diversified, and people can really choose something that, you know, that tailor to their personal taste. So it's very interesting how it changes. So it's not really one culture dominates, but it's more like integration and just very diversified choices.
Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of having a service that doesn't think in terms of borders. Previously, if you're looking at like, oh, you know, film distribution within the country, or you're thinking about a broadcast network, this was naturally your instinct to cater and program for the local market. But when you allow a global service to happen, then, you know, you kind of think globally, which I think is beautiful.
Sure. I mean, I can understand that as well, because I do stand-up comedy in Chinese, I do comedy in English, and when I do a comedy piece, I'm not looking into the pocket of people's, like, you know, bags and asking what passport they have. I want to know what their life is like. What is a real life experience? What can I talk about from my experience that I think is funny? that these people think is funny. And that doesn't break down very cleanly across national borderlines. And it's probably why you can see that there are storylines, characters, relationships, story arcs, even as you said, genres. Once you get into that level of thinking, you may not know exactly how any given piece is going to play in another country, but you know that if you follow good storytelling practice and shoot something that's engaging, people will get engaged enough to maybe get along with the characters, and people have clearly shown, I mean, animation will watch a story about two fish. So like, you know, people are willing to watch a story if it has the elements of story and that doesn't break down across country lines.
Yeah, just want to give you one question, 这个 Jesse.
Sure.
因为你
You are doing stand-up comedy in China. You are one of the earliest stand-up comedian in China because it's very late, it's very recent industry. What is your biggest difficulty which prevent you from doing better?
介绍一下，因为我
I was talking in Chinese. When I came to China in 2012, I learned the 相声 the dialogue, comic dialogue from Mr. Ding Guangquan, a comic dialogue master. That was the very beginning, an essence, really the birth of the stand-up comedy in China. There were between 8 to 10 people in China who did it in small bars, and audience didn't know what it meant. We had to make introduction about stand-up comedy. I said that it's the American comic style from the beginning. I think that, personally, I think that the difficulty is a universal difficulty that every comedian has encountered. What I should say, what I can say, what I can transfer my message to the audience. Maybe they can feel empathic or they can feel different vis-a-vis myself. And because I came to China 7 years ago, I feel that my experience in China is getting closer and closer than the local Chinese people. Apart from that, we always are encountering difficulty in life. For example, how for a young man to get a good job, how to be successful in your career, how to get a girlfriend. This is my personal question, how to get a girlfriend. So this is really something that interests everybody. So that's why I say that the very point of comedy is that you can cheat. You cannot cheat. Artistic movie can be very subjective, but a comedy, when it's not funny, it's not funny. People will not laugh. You cannot cheat on this. They cannot fake it. When I'm trying to tell a joke, everybody doing that was not funny. I knew that it's not funny. Apart from that, platform is very important. When I came back to United States, I talked about what I did in China because I had to explain the background. They didn't know about China, but in China, I have another storytelling. I have another storyline. I think a comedian should have an attitude how to have two storytelling to two cultures, but with the same attitude. This is maybe the difficulty. But it's very interesting, very challenging. I think it's very funny. Very interesting. I will ask you one more question. You are a very special person among us. Now we are thinking that the world is getting more and more horizontal than. But for the creator, they always have some dilemma because creation is a very local thing.
Because this is an issue for anybody who doesn't look like most of the people that surround them. So Chinese people working in Hollywood, Americans working in China, anybody who doesn't look like the people around them, it's hard to find allies in the creative process because the allies are there, but it may be harder to find them. So one of the challenges as a comedy writer in China is there are no other people that can look at me in the face and say, oh, your story might be like mine. Let me invite you into our writer's room just to meet people. The only way I get into a writer's room is I write with Chinese people and they can see if I'm good, they invite me on to the next show. If I'm not good, I don't get invited back, which is the way a lot of writers have to work. But in a world that's now increasingly globalized, my hope is that, for instance, people who are trying to write in Hollywood, they'll see people and they'll say, oh, hopefully you don't have to go through everything as hard as I did 20 years ago, because there are people that understand that that the story that you bring with you may be a universal story, even if you don't look like most of the people that are sitting around the room in the same room. And I think that the answer really does come from, as a writer, as a comedy writer, the answer, a lot of it does come through writing and the storytelling process. You can't, like, you can't ask like 10 people from Ohio in America and then invite an Asia culture consultant to come on your show and expect the show's gonna be good. But that was actually state of the art 10 years ago, which is terrifying. And then similarly, as Asia tries to go abroad and exert Asia's cultural influence, we need to find a way to get the people from other parts of the world into the writer's room, the storytelling room earlier in the process, because they will be able to identify what the core element of the story is. What's the part that's really gonna speak to the audience back where I'm from? And it's not necessarily anything that's a gimmick. A lot of times if you dig down, it's like, what an interesting character relationship between the father and the son. What an interesting setting. I never even would have thought that, this industry existed. Those sorts of things, if you get them in the earliest part of the process in the writing, you can build something that comes out naturally more international, as opposed to if you bring on a consultant late in the process and then you can make sure that, oh, we didn't say anything culturally offensive, but that's a really low bar. Yeah.
And do you observe the industry changing? I mean, like you talked about how it might be a disadvantage being different. But there might also be an advantage.
Yeah,
Do you see the industry increasingly being more accepting of someone with a different profile?
Yeah, I think in China there's lots of advantages to being an American comedy writer in China. There are some disadvantages. I think on the advantages part, I think that the mentality, especially for platforms like iQIYI and the internet platforms, are growing much closer to the Western platforms in the way that we think about the art. Unless you go to some really local TV station from a fourth-tier city in China, the people's mentality towards the creative process is growing more similar. And so as an American, to be able to come in with a similar process but a different angle and a different life experience, that's very useful and that's a big advantage. The disadvantages, a lot of it's just like paperwork stuff. Recently there might be, you might need a license, like a 主持人资格, like a hosting license to do comedy in China. And if that happens, I'm just out. So now in China, there's obviously, there's never one way to do anything. And so this is not to say that, we're completely gone, but my worry comes from stuff like that because I have no control over it. Whereas if I tell a bad story and it doesn't get aired, well, that's my fault. But if those system issues get worse, that's going to get worse. But from my perspective, the systems are going to do what the systems are going to do. I can't control that. What I can control is people to people. So let's just say I have this audience in front of me. What do I do to reach them? That's something I can think about. And I think the Asian creators are thinking about the same thing too. They just, a lot of them, including myself, are still adjusting to this new world where you have something like Netflix and you don't need to convince the studio head of every individual country's TV station to air your product. As a creator, we may live in a better world now where I can just say, like, what's the right story I need to tell? And then if you can make it well, a lot of other stuff that as a writer, I don't want to deal with 190 countries, contracts. I'd rather have it on one platform and then get it out there and I can go back to writing,
Yeah, interesting. 好，那么
Okay. The next question is to all of you. It's more realistic question. As somebody in the culture industry, would you represent as platform or as enterprise? What should we do to better promote Asian culture, to better impact or to better be integrated into the world, to better promote also Asian soft power? Carol.
Soft power is the natural attraction for people to follow you. So it's very interesting when Kuek talk about the Monkey King. And when we think about that, China has Kung Fu, has Tai Chi. We even have like Tai Chi in the morning here. So those things travel much further and in a natural way than some of the sort of like government-led or like state initiatives. So I guess we need to create that space for grassroots things to bubble up and then spread on its own. So I think that's one thing that could be helpful. Another thing I think, just reflecting back on my own experiences, I was born and raised in mainland China. I went to all local public school until I was 16, did not even speak English, and then went to the US. So when I went abroad, I was actually kind of lost because I don't know what to trust because there's such diversified voices and things are not black and white anymore. Things are colorful, things are gray. So I think when we try to explain our own stories, we need to, think about credibility, authenticity, right, objectivity, so we can really, not just lean to one side. I think a lot of times, even when I went abroad, like in the beginning, I think about myself as the China ambassador. So I want to tell the world about all the good things that China does. But when I do that, I lose all credibility. Because of course we celebrate the progress that China makes, and we're so proud of what it has achieved. But on the other side, China is the least country to say that we have no problems. So I think just acknowledging that and address some of the most serious criticisms, and then talk about sort of the positive things that it has been doing. So that would be a much more convincing way to get the messages across. And also when we think about Chinese culture, I guess I can only speak for China. In the Confucius culture, it's more about, sort of talk less and do more. So if you're talking too much about yourself or explaining yourself all the time, you're actually frowned upon. You're considered like 太虚了，这个人不实在, right? 不靠谱, right?
It means that it's not a realistic person.
The world has changed and put the emphasis on communication. No matter if you're in the government, you're in the corporate, right, you're talking to a friend, it's all about creating your own story, an authentic story. So I think we need to sort of re-put that emphasis on communication and sort of like not look down on the talking part, right? Of course we do what we do. Even when I think about, governments in China, the Chinese officials, they can do a fabulous job. They actually need to do a good job in order for them to be promoted, different from the Western system. The Western system is, you promise first, and then whether you deliver or not, we'll see, right? So it's actually much more emphasis on the talking part to get people to buy in. It's the electability. While in China, it's always emphasized on the doing. But I guess now the world has changed and China has risen to the world stage. We really need to start thinking about or emphasizing on more training on the communication part, so people become more sophisticated communicators, or else it's not palatable the way that it's communicated to the international community.
一方面 OK，
你说。
一方面要多做，
For one thing, we need to do more, but on the other hand, we need to communicate more. And the third one, we need to be very reasonable when we are talking about ourselves.
Areas, I was talking to a lot of the scientists and other panels, and the science has advanced beyond scientists' ability to communicate the science to people in the world. And I don't think it's just science. I think it's a lot of arts and a lot of places. But to that, I would kind of add a little bit of a warning, which is to say, having the communication skills really evolved without any content underneath it is also dangerous. We were talking about this earlier backstage about what is the value of having social influence if it's not actually tied to an ethos that is a positive ethos. Because at the end of the day, the whole point of being able to get up on stage is fun. Yay, it's great to be able to perform. I like getting applause. That's all good, but if you're only doing it for the applause, whether the applause is actual physical applause or whether it's a likes or whether it's a clicks or whether it's even profit, you know, you're missing out on the ability and the whole potential of the fact that we can all now reach each other. So if we reach each other with works that get a lot of hits, but actually don't have any ethos behind them, at the very best it's wasteful, and at the worst it can actually be used by people who want to, you know, do bad things in the world. And so for us at the Comedy Center, this is a little bit of a trick because, you know, we can make comedy that makes fun of each other, but that's not ultimately all that useful. And it's a lot easier for me to get a laugh doing a stereotype joke than to do a laugh trying to really dig and figure out what it means to have a, you know, a global world where we laugh together. So part of the challenge for me in working with media is try to figure out how to have partners that will give us the time in the writing room not to take the first joke, not to take the second joke, not to take the third joke, unless it really is the one that we want to tell and it's aligned with the mission of what we want to tell. And in that case, I'm happy to kind of live or die on that hill as a performer, because even if the worst case scenario it didn't work, a lot of comedy doesn't work. So at least I made it in a way that was, if it did work, it would not only have influence, but a positive influence.
But to that point, I think, you know, just thinking about China on its own, it has come so far in, you know, the past like 40 years. It has a lot of content, but the past attitude is, you know, 走自己的路，让别人去。
So we just need to do what we want to do.
A more proactive stance and take more initiative to explain yourself to help others understand you rather
Yeah.
than, you know, let yourself be understood.
For sure. And I agree with your previous point to add on to what you said about sharing your own story. Also look for the allies who can help you tell your story. I've performed at like colleges in America and around the world talking about the xiangsheng, the traditional crosstalk comedy. And a lot of the people in the audience are Chinese people who like crosstalk. And they're so happy that they see, that you see like, you know, people from America that have no China background might come to see me talk about it. Is it wrong that they wouldn't come to see a Chinese person? Maybe. But they're glad that at least they maybe would come and one more person comes and learns about Chinese comedy because I came and did it. Well, that's probably a good thing. And so by Asian people and Western people working together, you can attract audiences that might not have come based off of the image of something. And then once people are in, they realize a universal thing underneath that.
And that's grassroots diplomacy.
Yeah, we're trying. It's real grassroots.
Another thing that I'd like to add about sharing stories and about talking about yourself or the projects that you're working on, it really comes down to the motivation why you're telling these stories. And if your motivation is to influence others and to inspire others, then it's a great thing. Telling stories is wonderful in that context. So I do encourage individuals or companies who are creating impact, whether it's big or small, to tell those stories, not just to float their own boat, but really to inspire others and to be leaders in their field, and also, I must say, to have a little competition, you know, to compete in the field of I'm doing good, you know, so I'm creating impact, and that's another positive way of using influence.
Thank you. Kuek?
Your original question was on what we need to do so that, you know, Asian content can travel more and we can make use of that influence.
Yeah.
And something that Jessie said really struck a chord in a surprising way. You know, when you said that what was maybe an impediment or a challenge for you was actually the paperwork, I didn't get you in the first instance.
I have so much paperwork. Yes.
But, you know, I mean, like, you know, companies like artists sometimes face the same challenges. There's so much good work we can do. I mean, like, we're really working with, like, you know, the talent, like the ones on stage who work so hard at their craft in their storytelling. We are working to give consumers what they are looking for. But sometimes it's hard when you get bogged down by the paperwork or you use the word system. like everything I described about how the content can travel from point A to point B is only possible if you have one global product. And you know, if we didn't have that ability to have that travel content, then the whole machinery would not work the way we were hoping for it to. So I mean, like that to me was something that came to mind, because when Jesse said what he did, it was not something I thought about, but when I thought about it, it really made a lot of sense.
Yeah. 所以我想，我们刚刚听到
Just now, we've heard about the opinions from our four experts. How can we better help our contents to influence the whole world? First, we need to be very proactive. Second, we need to be reasonable, and we need to precisely describe ourselves, especially in the international cultural context. Just now, Jesse mentioned that as a content contributor, you need to have a very precise purpose, what we really want to express. So we need to understand our purpose, our target. This can be very helpful, because that is how we can promote our culture to reach the whole world. So we need to understand the purpose. Of course, culture have diversified purposes, and we need to have a more interesting topic. So in different areas of the world, probably there are kinds of forms, but the core, the root is very similar. That is, we need to have closer ties with our audience, and we need to inspire our stories, and so that we can promote our culture to reach the rest of the world. This is how we do our work, and this is what we need to do, how to explore our good systems, our stories, and to better help our users and communicate with our customers, so that in a new economic area, we can have more and better contents. Thank you very much for your opinions. So we have 5 minutes left. So the floor is open. Anyone who want to ask questions, please raise your hand. Okay, the one with white shirt. Thank you. To whom you want to ask your question? Mr. Kuek, just now you mentioned Monkey King, Sun Wukong. I'm now doing a project concerning Monkey King. But as we all know, this theme is, used by many people, and how we can innovate and have more innovation to have closer connection with today's world, and how we can help this content to reach to the rest of the world. Can you share with us your opinions? Actually, I really love Monkey King, even though there are different versions of Monkey King.
I don't come from a content creation background, so I don't necessarily have the best advice for you, but we have a team here, and we'd be happy to connect you to our content team. But I would say that, like for us, it really is always about the authenticity of the storytelling, and for someone not coming from a content background, this is the best I can do.
Thank you. I think that's sir over there. Please identify yourself before you ask the question, okay?
在后面。
在后面的那位先生，他是刚刚第二。
So, the gentleman in the back row.
Thank you. For Mr. Kuek and the rest of the panel, I love the discussion. You mentioned a very interesting point about how media has now been democratized given the internet platforms and Netflix, where you can just upload to Netflix, and Netflix takes control and can distribute to over 190 countries. Do you see the fact that with Netflix growing and becoming such a big player, that it can evolve to become almost too big and almost monopolizing the media space? And how do you see that moving forward in terms of the democratization of media in general?
Competition is very keen. I mean, like, you know, within this market, you would see that the VOD sector is a very active one. At an earlier session that I was at, people were talking about the competition that was out there as well. I think we are way, way, way off from anywhere near such a situation. I think, you know, you chose the word democratization. And I think the internet really creates a level playing field that introduces so many different players into the ecosystem. We think it's great. I think it brings about behavioral change amongst our consumers, which is eventually the audience that we want to serve. But I think we're way off, but thank you for the confidence in the company.
Thank you. And I think that's sir over there. Okay. And we'll have the last one after this.
Thank you for your sharing. I'd like to give you some specific context first and then ask a more general question, if that's okay. My name is Satish Selvanathan. I work in the palm oil business in Malaysia and Indonesia. My industry currently has an appalling reputation, primarily driven by environmental impact, killing monkeys, and deforestation.
And elephants.
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt some of this is true, for sure, right? But some of it is also probably due to a small sample size, whereby you take a small subset of population that does this and blows it out of proportion. What advice would you have for someone like myself who's looking to, first of all, uncover the truth behind the industry, take the steps to acknowledge the mistakes, fix the mistakes, and then subsequently to improve perception?
Is this addressed to
anybody?
me? Okay.
Thanks to you, Nadya.
I would say, you know, the palm oil industry, palm oil itself is not the enemy, as obviously you would know. If we were to replace or substitute palm oil for any other oil, it would have actually worse effects on the environment. What happens actually is it's not the palm oil that's bad, it is the way that the deforestation has been happening in the past. To acknowledge it, the younger generations in the industry have acknowledged, majority have acknowledged what has happened, and they are keen to move forward in a more sustainable way. I think maybe some of the easiest thing to do would be to partner with local NGOs who are working on the ground in the areas where you work, and see what it is that they need, and maybe even bring a local NGO in-house, because NGOs often set up an NGO with a beneficiary in mind, but they have specific talents in operating an NGO, and those talents do not include legal, HR, biz dev, you know, all of these things. And there is this concept of being able to in-house an NGO, and maybe that's what you guys could do, just throwing that out there, and looking at the most viable areas that are critical to biodiversity and wildlife and habitat, and work towards, for example, re-establishing corridors for elephants, or creating protected areas for orangutans within your reserves or the areas which you work. So there are simple things that need to happen, and then also look at funding projects long term. So not only lending expertise in terms of your legal HR and all of those things that usually the NGOs, when they raise money, they raise funds, a lot of the funds that they raise have to go into covering the costs of staff or covering the cost of services or hiring someone who can write grants. But if all of those can be taken away and they can use the funds that they've raised to actually focus on the cause, then they can do a lot more great work. I don't believe that there is a bad guy. And, you know, traditionally in the past, admittedly, the NGO, the pulp and paper and palm oil guys have wanted to engage Nadya, and I have been adamant and have said absolutely no way. There's absolutely no way I can align myself with pulp and paper palm oil, right? But if my motivation is to save a species, or at least prolong or delay the extinction of a species, I'm happy to work with anyone. If it means greenwashing for you guys, if it means looking good, you know, or really actually creating impact, if that species has a chance by increasing the gene pool, by reconnecting corridors, or whatever it is that the specific needs are, whether it's training for the local communities so they can understand how to mitigate conflict and things like that, and providing those tools, that's cool. That's super cool. And I think it's these conversations that really need to happen, because traditional conversations around sustainability and conservation have always been activist versus business, and that just doesn't work. Clearly we have failed when we have taken that approach. Thank you for your question, super valuable.
Thank you. 抱歉，时间原因。
I'm sorry, we're short of time, but we're running out of time. If you have any question, we can have exchange offline. Please applause for our excellent